There are places in this world where things simply disappear. Ships swallowed by the ocean, people lost without a trace. But few things are more terrifying than when a plane, a massive machine of steel and engineering carrying hundreds of souls, vanishes into thin air. No wreckage, no bodies, no answers. These are not just stories. These are real-life nightmares. Planes hijacked by ghosts, pilots who vanish mid-flight, aircraft that take off and are never seen again. The sky holds secrets darker than we can imagine. And tonight, we open the doors to these mysteries, one by one. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear may never let you fly again. The Phantom of Flight 305, the D.B. Cooper mystery. The rain lashed against the tarmac as Northwest Orient Airlines, Flight 305, prepared for departure. The evening of November 24th, 1971, was no different from any other in Portland, Oregon. A cold grey sky, weary travelers, the buzz of airport intercoms announcing flight schedules. Passengers shuffled through the jet bridge, tucking their tickets into pockets, dragging their luggage behind them. It was the night before Thanksgiving, a busy time for air travel. People longed to be home, to be with family, to escape into the warmth of the holiday. Among them, a man in a dark suit boarded quietly. He was neither too tall nor too short, neither young nor old, his features forgettable, except for the pair of dark sunglasses that obscured his eyes. A plain white dress shirt, a narrow black tie, a raincoat draped over his arm. Nothing about him drew attention. He carried no luggage, just a slim black briefcase gripped tightly in his right hand. He walked down the aisle with deliberate, measured steps and lowered himself into seat 18C. Flight attendants took little notice. A businessman, they assumed, perhaps exhausted from a long day. He ordered a bourbon and soda, paying in crisp bills, and leaned back into his seat, waiting. Minutes passed. The engines roared to life, the cabin shuddering as the aircraft taxied down the runway. The dim cabin lights flickered slightly as Flight 305 lifted into the overcast sky, swallowed by the looming storm. It was time. The man reached into his pocket and withdrew a small slip of paper. He waited, patient, until one of the flight attendants, Florence Schaffner, passed by. When she did, he caught her attention with a slight nod, then extended the note to her. She barely looked at it. Notes were common. Men often passed them to the stewardesses, usually some clumsy flirtation scribbled onto a napkin. She smirked and slipped it into her pocket, moving to walk away. A hand gripped her wrist, gentle but firm. Cold fingers. Steady. "Miss," the man said in a voice so low it barely carried over the hum of the engines. "You'd better read that note. I have a bomb." Florence froze. Her stomach tightened into a knot, her skin prickling with sudden sweat. She glanced at his face, trying to read his expression behind the dark lenses, but he was impossibly calm. Almost absent. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper. The message was neatly written, precise, every letter deliberate. "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the aircraft. No funny business or everyone dies." A wave of nausea swept over her. She looked up, her throat dry, and saw that he was watching her, waiting, expectant. "Show me," she whispered. Without hesitation, the man flicked open the latches of the briefcase just enough for her to see inside. A tangle of red wires, cylindrical sticks bound together. A mechanism of terror. Her vision blurred. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. "Tell the pilot," he said. "Now." Florence stumbled toward the cockpit, her knees weak, her hands shaking violently. When she entered, the pilots turned to her with casual smiles until they saw her face. Captain William Scott listened as she relayed the message. The air in the cockpit grew heavier with each word. There had been hijackings before, but never like this. Never so calculated. So quiet. Scott contacted air traffic control, relaying the demands. The message made its way up the chain, reaching the FBI in Seattle. Agents scrambled, gathering the ransom, organizing the parachutes fueling the plane. No risks could be taken. A bomb mid-air meant certain death for everyone. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers sensed something was wrong. Flight attendants moved with uncharacteristic stiffness, voices hushed. Nervous glances were exchanged. A baby began crying, the sound piercing through the thick tension. The man, still calm, took another sip of bourbon. "Miss," he said, gesturing for Florence to return. "Sit down." She obeyed, unable to do anything else. "Is everything in motion?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. He nodded, satisfied. The plane circled Seattle-Tacoma International Airport for over 2 hours. Outside, the sky had turned black, storm clouds rolling in. The rain pelted the fuselage, streaking the windows. The passengers were told there was a minor delay. They had no idea a man with a bomb sat among them, dictating the fate of their lives. Finally, the ransom and parachutes were delivered. The plane landed, but the man would not step outside. He allowed all passengers to leave, along with a few crew members, but the pilots, he needed them. And so, with his demands met, he gave a new order. "Take off, head south toward Mexico." The engines roared once more, and Flight 305 ascended into the stormy void, carrying a ghost. But this ghost was not meant to stay. Midway through the flight, the man methodically secured the parachutes to his back. He checked the cash, neatly packed into a bag. Then, he walked to the rear of the plane. "Open the door," he ordered. The remaining crew pleaded with him. It was suicide. They were high above the forests of Washington state, the wind howling violently outside. No sane man would jump, but he was already gone. The air filled with a deafening roar as he opened the rear air stair. The force of the wind nearly knocked them all off their feet. And then, he stepped forward, into the dark, into the storm. Vanished. The plane landed hours later, empty of its phantom. Authorities scoured the forests below for months, searching for his body, for the money, for anything. But there was nothing. No parachute, no corpse, no trace. Years passed. The FBI interrogated suspects, investigated leads, followed whispers and rumors. A portion of the ransom money was discovered buried near the Columbia River in 1980. Decayed, forgotten, abandoned. But not D.B. Cooper. Some say he died in the fall, his body lost to the wilderness. Others insist he survived, slipping into the shadows, living the rest of his days as a man who cheated the sky. The truth remains elusive. The storm still holds its secrets. The haunting of Flight 601, the disappearing hijacker. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt coffee and the murmur of quiet conversations as Aerolíneas Argentinas Flight 601 prepared for takeoff. It was July 31st, 1973, a humid evening in Buenos Aires. The passengers were a mix of businessmen, families, and weary travelers, their faces blending into a mosaic of exhaustion and anticipation. They settled into their seats, flipping through magazines, adjusting their watches, staring absent-mindedly out of the windows at the fading light. And then, there was him. No one recalled when exactly he boarded. He wasn't there. And then suddenly, he was. He sat alone in the middle of the cabin, a man in a brown suit, a dark tie knotted tightly at his throat. His face was unremarkable, forgettable. His eyes, however, were not. They were dark and empty, as if they had seen too much or nothing at all. He carried no luggage, no newspaper, no sign that he was going anywhere at all. Just himself, and a silence that clung to him like a shadow. Flight 601 lifted off the ground, climbing steadily into the night. The lights of the city melted away beneath them, swallowed by the darkness. The passengers relaxed into their seats, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just a few rows away. He waited. Minutes passed. The hum of the engines filled the air, a steady vibration running through the cabin. And then he moved. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, as if controlled by something unseen. His shoes barely made a sound as he walked down the aisle, weaving through the rows, unnoticed at first. He stopped just before the cockpit door, tilting his head slightly as if listening to something beyond it. And then, without hesitation, he stepped inside. The pilots barely had time to react before the cold barrel of a gun pressed against the back of the co-pilot's skull. "Turn the plane around," the man said, his voice eerily devoid of emotion. "We are going somewhere else now." The pilots tensed. Hijackings were not uncommon, but something about this was different. There was no rage in his voice, no urgency, no demands. Just a statement, simple and inarguable. "Where do you want us to go?" the captain asked, keeping his voice calm. The man didn't answer right away. He tilted his head again as if listening to something distant, something no one else could hear. "Just fly," he whispered. The air inside the cockpit thickened, heavy with something invisible but suffocating. The pilots exchanged glances, their hands hovering over the controls. "You need to tell us where," the captain said carefully. The man blinked slowly. "You'll know soon enough," he murmured. Then he turned. He walked out of the cockpit as silently as he had entered, making his way down the aisle. This time the passengers noticed him. A mother clutched her child closer. A businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A stewardess watched him, her breath hitching in her throat as he passed. Something was wrong. He walked all the way to the back of the plane, stopping at the emergency exit. The red handle gleamed under the dim cabin lights. Passengers turned their heads, murmurs rising, confusion spreading like a virus. He reached for the handle. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Someone screamed. A flight attendant rushed forward, arms outstretched, pleading, "Sir, stop! You can't!" But he already had. With impossible strength, he yanked the lever. The door wrenched open with a deafening roar, the wind shrieking through the cabin. The force of it sent papers flying, drinks toppling, passengers gripping their seats in terror. The man stepped forward, unflinching, staring into the abyss beyond the door. And then he jumped. No parachute, no hesitation. Just gone. The wind howled through the gaping doorway, the sky beyond it an endless black void. The cabin was chaos, screams, crying, frantic hands reaching for oxygen masks. The flight crew scrambled to seal the door, the pressure inside the cabin plummeting. The aircraft trembled, fighting against the sudden force of the open air, and then it was over. The door was shut, the air settled, the plane flew on. Silence crept back into the cabin, fragile and uneasy. The passengers stared at one another, eyes wide, faces pale. Some whispered prayers. Others simply sat, shaking, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The pilots contacted air traffic control, their voices tight with panic. Authorities on the ground scrambled into action. A search was launched, the area below combed for any sign of him, his body, his clothing, any trace that he had hit the earth. There was nothing. No remains, no wreckage, no impact site. He was simply gone. The seat he had occupied, unassigned, his name, never on the manifest. It was as if he had never existed at all. To this day, no one knows who he was, where he came from, or where he went. The official reports list it as a hijacking gone wrong. But those who were on board Flight 601 know the truth. Something unnatural happened that night. And somewhere, in the skies over Argentina, the wind still carries the whisper of a name that no one remembers. The vanishing of Flight 522. The ghost plane. The morning of August 14th, 2005, was like any other in Athens, Greece. The sun gleamed against the tarmac, as Helios Airways Flight 522 prepared for takeoff, its passengers filing on board, stowing luggage, exchanging tired greetings. It was a routine flight, Athens to Prague, with a brief stop in Cyprus. The crew moved about the cabin with the casual ease of experience, checking seatbelts, offering faint smiles, securing the doors. Pilots performed their final checks, murmuring into their headsets as the aircraft hummed with life. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. Minutes after takeoff, something shifted. The radio crackled inside the cockpit. A warning light blinked. An alarm pulsed somewhere deep within the controls, a shrill, rhythmic wail. The pilots frowned, scanning their instruments. A pressurization alert. A quick check of the cabin, oxygen levels dropping. The air inside the plane grew thinner, almost imperceptibly. Passengers adjusted in their seats, rubbing their temples, blinking heavily. Flight attendants exchanged wary glances, their movements slightly sluggish. A child whined, tugging at his mother's sleeve. Something was wrong. The pilot radioed air traffic control. His voice was calm, measured, but laced with a creeping unease. Helios 522, we have a pressurization warning. Request immediate return to Athens. The reply was lost in static. The cabin air continued to thin. A flight attendant made her way to the cockpit, her steps uneven, her vision blurring. And then, silence. The captain's hands trembled on the controls. His co-pilot slumped forward unconscious. The world blurred at the edges, his thoughts unraveling like frayed string. His fingers felt distant, disconnected from his body. He reached for the oxygen mask, missed, his vision tunneled. And then, blackness. The plane flew on, alone, unmanned. A silent, ghostly vessel cutting through the sky. Greek air traffic control tried to reach Flight 522. Their calls met with nothing but static. No response, no communication. Just a cold, empty signal stretching into the void. They sent fighter jets to intercept. 2 F-16s soared through the sky, slicing through the clouds, closing in on the rogue aircraft. As they approached, the pilots braced themselves. Would they find a bomb threat? A hijacker? A malfunction? The first F-16 pilot drew alongside the cockpit window and peered inside. His blood ran cold. The captain and co-pilot sat motionless in their seats, their faces eerily still, their hands limp at their sides. Their eyes, vacant, frozen. The cabin beyond them was a tomb, rows of passengers slumped lifelessly in their seats, heads tilted, bodies unmoving. A silent, drifting graveyard, suspended at 34,000 feet. The fighter pilot swallowed, his pulse thundering in his ears. He turned his gaze back to the cockpit and froze. There was movement. Someone, something, was inside. A lone figure moved through the cockpit, staggering, unsteady. A man, a flight attendant, the only one left. His name was Andreas Prodromou, a steward with Helios Airways. When the cabin lost pressure, he had managed, against all odds, to secure an emergency oxygen mask. The rest of the crew had fallen, their minds slipping into unconsciousness before they even knew what was happening. But Andreas had survived. For hours he stumbled through the aircraft, trying to wake the pilots, shaking them, pleading with them. Their skin was cold, their breath non-existent. He was alone. He staggered into the cockpit, his hands trembling as he reached for the controls. The plane was running out of fuel, the engines sputtered. Through the window he saw them, fighter jets, flanking him on either side. Help! He grabbed the radio. His voice was weak, desperate. Mayday! Mayday! The words were swallowed by static. The engines coughed. The plane shuddered. He turned back toward the cabin one last time. Rows of silent passengers, eyes closed, trapped in an endless sleep. The final moments approached. The fuel ran dry. The engines failed. The ground rushed up to meet them. The crash site was a blackened scar in the hills of Grammatikos, Greece. Emergency responders combed through the wreckage, the air thick with smoke and the distant wails of sirens. The bodies of 121 passengers and crew lay among the debris, victims not of fire or impact, but of something more insidious. They had all been dead long before the crash. Investigators determined that the plane had suffered a gradual decompression, starving the passengers and crew of oxygen before they could even react. One by one, they had lost consciousness, their minds drifting into a sleep from which they would never wake. Except for one. Andreas. The man who fought against the inevitable. The man who piloted a ghost plane with the last breath he had left. The man who, for those final moments, carried the weight of an entire flight on his shoulders. Flight 522 will never be forgotten. Some say, on quiet nights over Greece, pilots still hear whispers over the radio. A weak, trembling voice. Mayday, Mayday. A voice lost to the void. The cursed flight, 370. The plane that vanished. The night of March 8, 2014, was like any other in Kuala Lumpur. The airport bustled with the quiet hum of late-night departures, the low murmur of conversations, the occasional chime of boarding announcements. Families said their goodbyes, tired travelers shuffled through security, pilots sipped their final cups of coffee before another long-haul flight. In the middle of it all, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 prepared for takeoff. 239 souls boarded the Boeing 777 bound for Beijing. Businessmen, tourists, students, entire families, all unaware that they were stepping onto a plane that would never reach its destination. The passengers settled into their seats. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, offering warm towels and quiet reassurances. In the cockpit, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and First Officer Farik Hamid ran through their pre-flight checklist, their voices steady, routine. The engines rumbled to life. Flight 370 lifted off into the warm Malaysian night. The city lights faded beneath them, swallowed by the endless dark. At 1:19 a.m., Captain Zahari's voice crackled over the radio. "Good night, Malaysia 370. And then, silence. The aircraft vanished. Not just from radar, not just from communication, from existence. At first, no one panicked. It was normal for flights to slip in and out of radar coverage over the ocean. There were handoffs between air traffic controls, minor delays in transponders pinging back. But minutes passed, then an hour. No response. Air traffic controllers in Vietnam tried to make contact. Silence. Beijing called. Silence. The flight should have checked in, should have made routine reports, should have been visible somewhere. But Flight 370 was gone, as if it had never been in the sky at all. The first waves of unease spread through control rooms across Asia. Calls were made, search teams scrambled, fighter jets were put on alert. Then, the horror deepened. Military radar picked up something strange. A plane, but not just any plane. Flight 370, not heading toward Beijing, turning, looping, flying back over Malaysia, veering west into the open ocean, cutting through the night like a phantom. Why? No distress signal, no hijack alert, no word from the pilots. Just this silent, eerie change in direction, as if guided by unseen hands. Hours passed. The plane kept moving. Then, somewhere over the vast empty waters of the Indian Ocean, it disappeared again, for good. The world erupted in chaos. Search teams deployed. Satellites scanned the seas. Ships combed thousands of miles of open water. Nothing. It was as if the plane had been swallowed whole by the sky. Days passed, then weeks. A shadow of a trail emerged, data from an Inmarsat satellite, picking up ghostly pings from the aircraft long after it lost contact. The last ping? Far, far from any land, deep in the heart of the Indian Ocean. A place where nothing survives. Theories exploded like wildfire. A mechanical failure? But that wouldn't explain the eerie turn, the silent hours of flight before vanishing. A hijacking? But no terrorist group claimed responsibility, no demands, no ransom, suicide. Was the captain responsible? But why fly for hours out into the abyss? Then, the darker whispers. That Flight 370 never crashed at all, that something else took it, that the plane is still out there, flying through the endless night, never landing, never found. Even now, debris washes up on distant shores, fragments of metal, pieces of a wing, echoes of a plane that no longer exists. But the black box remains unfound, the passengers remain lost, and Flight 370 remains the greatest mystery of the sky. Some say, on the right frequency, if you listen carefully enough, you can still hear it. A faint voice, a whisper in the static. "Good night, Malaysia 370, and then nothing.